afternoon, everyone. We continue the program with our next session, which is hosted by Klear.ai. This session is titled The Use of New Technology in Fraud Detection and Mitigation, and here to share their expert insights on this topic are our esteemed panelists. It is my pleasure to introduce Anand Shiru, Senior Vice President, Market Development with Klear.ai, Jessica Albano, SIU Unit Leader with Westfield, Frank Neugenbauer, Senior Architect, Cincinnati Insurance Companies, Steve Robles, Assistant Chief Executive Officer, County of Los Angeles, and Dennis Tierney, Senior Vice President, National Director of Workers' Compensation Claims with Marsh. And over to you, Anand.
Sure. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining this session. This session is on the use of new technology in the fraud detection as well as the mitigation. My name is Anand Shirur. I work as the Senior Vice President with Klear.ai, and our company basically develops the predictive analytics suite for the insurance domain. I personally been working in the fraud detection space for last 10 years or so, and this is an area which is close to my heart. Right. Fraud within the claims has been around for a while. The current estimates on the losses which are caused due to the fraudulent claims range anywhere between $60 billion a year to around $80 billion, different agencies and different statistics. But you'd agree that, whatever statistics you pick on, but the proportions are pretty staggering. Traditionally, the claims teams have relied solely on the acumen and the diligence of the claims examiner to be able to spot the suspicious claims successfully. But then it has its own pitfalls. Invariably, few fraudulent claims escapes attention, and there were still a few others, surprisingly, which were detected successfully but were not reported for a variety of reasons. And let me take a quick stab at the possible reasons. One reason was the high caseloads of the examiners. Why do I make my life more complicated than what it already is? Kind of an approach. There is a bit of personal bias which is kind of built in within the examiners. It's kind of human, and this personal bias could take many shapes and forms. The lack of incentives to highlight such cases. This is also a major factor because I've come across instances where the claims were successfully flagged, but the employers, for a variety of reasons, pushed these detections under the carpets. The high cost of investigating these claims. So is it worth it? Especially for the claims which where the incurred dollars are not very high, one probably will not go to the lengths to investigate them. Another, to a lesser extent, the lack of training to be able to spot the behavioral red flags within the claims is one of the other factors. So whatever be the reason, the results were missed opportunity to reduce the cost of the claims. On the other hand, the fraudsters, the ones who were perpetuating the fraud, they were smart too. They observed and they modified their modus operandi accordingly, further making it difficult to find the needle in the haystack, so to say. Recently, however, the technology, like the artificial intelligence and the machine learning technologies have come to the rescue, and they've been quite effective in being able to successfully flag the potentially fraudulent claims. They're able to draw on the multi-dimensional relationships that exist between different variables within your own data sets, and then use advanced statistical models to make accurate predictions. These technologies have been very objective, they've been very depersonalized, and they've been very dispassionate without any bias as far as detecting and then reporting is concerned. So it's not surprising that more and more organizations are exploring, and many are in the process of deploying these technologies. I'm sure some of the attendees that we see here belong to either of the groups, either exploring these technologies or in the process of deploying it. Right. Now, without further ado, let's hear from the professionals who've been at the forefront of either creating these technologies or using these technologies for reducing the cost of the claims overall. And this would be a good opportunity for the attendees to be able to leverage the experience of this esteemed panel to fine-tune your own workers' comp fraud detection initiatives. So let me start with Dennis. Dennis, as the head of workers' comp for Marsh, you interacted with scores of clients and you recorded their concerns. What are the main types of frauds that you commonly come across in the workers' comp?
Thanks, Anand. And yeah, your point is right on. I mean, in the workers' comp industry, fraud costs billions of dollars, right? So it's obviously a huge problem. So in the workers' comp industry, really, there's two main types of fraud that we see, right? The first one would be really centered around the injured worker, right? Kind of most obvious. And when we talk about injured worker fraud, we usually talk about it in two categories. The first would be what we refer to as hard fraud. What that is really intentional deception by that injured worker, right? Where they really don't have they didn't get hurt at work, they don't have a workers' comp claim, and as a result, they try to deceive the system. They try to get that claim accepted under workers' comp to achieve benefits, right? So that's the first area is hard fraud. The second type of fraud we see with injured workers involves what we call soft fraud. And what that is, you have situations where injured workers have accepted workers' compensation claims. And what they do is they exaggerate their injuries, right? They exaggerate it where they may try to bring in other body parts. They exaggerate it where they try to stay out longer than they need to, right? So they could continue to collect benefits, so on and so forth. So really, again, around injured workers, there's hard and soft, and that's kind of what we see usually. Sometimes the soft is actually even harder to deal with than the hard, right? Because, if something is not showing as something that should be accepted, that's sometimes to be clearer. Whereas the soft fraud, you have something that's accepted, and if that doctor continues to kind of keep them out, it could be a little bit more challenging kind of detecting that. Which kind of is a good segue to the other area that I wanted to talk about that we see a lot of in addition to injured worker fraud, and that is provider fraud, right? Provider fraud is another major issue that we see in the workers' comp world, and it covers kind of a gambit of different things, right? We could see it where just doctors over-treating, continually treating when they don't need to, and kind of constantly billing on certain things that they don't need to, billing for body parts that might not be accepted. We also see referrals. You have certain medical facilities where there might be a treating doctor, there might be physical therapy, so on and so forth. And we see situations where referrals are made within that group when they don't really need to. So that also could be an issue. Same thing with pharmacy type of things, compound drugs, things like that, right? So I would say, Anand, those are the two main things that we see around injured workers and around providers are the two main areas of fraud, at least in my experience, that we see.
Absolutely. I see your point. So Dennis, what you're saying is the claimant fraud and the provider fraud. So these two are the major pie within the types of fraud that you observed.
Correct.
Sure. Makes sense. My second part of the question to you, Dennis, is what are the new technologies which are available for identifying the fraud, abuse, and waste to the progressive claims handling teams? And how effective have these technologies been in identifying the true positives?
Yeah, so, I think, one of the, obviously we all know social media is a huge help for us detecting fraud, and we've been using that for quite some time, right? I think I saw a stat, 90% of millennials are on social media and 50% of baby boomers are on social media. So, tons of people are on social media, right? So obviously we all know that social media is, people put things on there and all that kind of stuff. But one of the things that I wanted to point out around that is, we're seeing more and more, carriers, partner with big data companies to do something that's called passive social listening, right? So what does that mean? So what that means is that what these big data companies do is they scan all these social network platforms, right? So they scan all the social network platforms, and if there's a match for that particular injured worker and or claimant, that this data will pick that up, and it would automatically be sent to that claim handler with a screenshot of what they saw, right? So if Dennis Tierney had a claim, they would scan those social media, they would have a match for Dennis Tierney, let's say on Facebook. They would recognize that, they would see what's showing, they take a screenshot, and they send that to that claim handler. And then that claim handler has the ability to do, what they want to do with that, right? So again, a way to, instead of just kind of looking in and maybe not finding something at the point in time, this is kind of doing it at different levels of points in time on the file, or how often we want to do it. So it has the ability to really not miss out when somebody is posting something on social media, right? And that could obviously lead to maybe, finding something that putting on there. It could lead to a lead where maybe you want to do some type of surveillance. But again, to me, we all know social media, it was being used greatly, but this new technology is just a better way to kind of find that needle in the haystack, like you mentioned, right? The other piece, so to answer the second part of that question, I think it has been successful, right? Using this kind of passive social listening, because it's helping identify, hits where people are active on social media. Whether or not that leads to, a fraudulent claim or not, that's more a follow, but at least it's identifying an opportunity, right? The other area I'll hit on and on is you kind of hit on it already, is just really, the use of AI and algorithms and predictive analytics, right? We have to lead with analytics now, right? So, claim providers, not every claim is going to get reported that's questionable or have a flag, right? So we need our claim providers to be using this technology to help identify red flags that maybe aren't out in front and center, which will enable it to go maybe to that special investigative unit to do that investigation, put the right resources on the file within that claim organization, do that investigation, or do whatever else needs to be done to make sure that claim is compensable, right? So now more than ever, using that AI, those algorithms to identify those claims that are not reported. Everybody knows the ones that are fraudulent, right? Monday morning or hints or clues, but the ones that are not, that's where we need these, the predictive model and the analytics to help us out. So those are the two of the areas that I'm seeing being utilized to help kind of new technologies to help combat this.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks for your inputs, Dennis. Moving to Jessica. Jessica, you spent a major part of your working life in the SIU. And you've been a very avid user as well as a proponent of these technologies. So my question is, what kind of technologies did you explore and deploy to counter the fraudulent claims? And what lesson does it actually hold for anyone wanting to set themselves up for a similar journey?
Yes, thank you, Anand. I'd like to say that, yes, I spent half my working life in SIU, so I started at 10 years old. So first of all, I wanted to go back and I think to set the framework, as far as the type of fraud that we encounter, we are super regional property casualty. So we see fraud in all lines of business. We see it in workers' comp lines of business, all the way to property theft, and the more complex where we have organized insurance fraud. So in our journey, we were looking to implement technology that would address all those lines of business, right? And that's not a very easy adventure to tackle. And it's funny because if I would answer this question probably maybe even a year, 2 years ago, it's very interesting how quickly that the use of technology has been able to move us at a greater speed than what I was able to do 10, 15 years ago. So along my journey, I laugh now when I talk about it, but I remember doing link association, trying to find patterns using color code. I used to joke with my big blackboard with my colored pencils and my markers. If you guys remember index, pillar, and trying to keep notes on that. So fast forward into 2021, along the journey that we've kind of been on, we've implemented open source. Dennis talked about social media.
Right.
We've implemented the business rules that most of the industry is aware of. But very recently, we've really been able to tap into the predictive analytics and the machine learning, AI, in combination with business rules, in combination with automation. And so what that has allowed us to do, and it's almost that we have to keep up because those fraudsters are one step ahead of us. So we've been able to identify all those types of fraud and some of the more complex at a much faster rate and get that file to the right person. So that answers, I think, the first part of your question, Anand. And so I'd like to kind of, it's interesting because when I look back of what that journey has been in the industry with fraud analytics, and it's kind of like a analytics continuum maturity level, and you would see each companies, if they're getting ready to embrace on that journey, is really to take a realistic view of where their organization is and on that maturity level for analytics. So
Right.
I share this with the attendees today that I would leave three business, or I say three lessons learned takeaways, and that is encourage an agile culture, engage data integrity stewardship at the enterprise level, and embrace change management. And if you let me, Anand, let me just expand on each one of those real quickly. So entertain an agile culture. I tell you, one of the things is that in order for you to embrace data analytics and AI, you also have to be able to be agile. Your workforce, your SIU, your claims people, your leadership has to be able to move and pivot in a very fast-paced environment. That's been a lesson, especially when you've been in the industry this long. Things are moving much quicker, and your competencies and your skill levels of your employees have to be able to keep up with that. Right. Especially any type of information security, data privacy, because when you're talking analytics, you are talking big data. It just opens a whole nother door of being able to be agile in that area. And I'll give you a perfect example, the pandemic. With the use of predictive analytics, we were able to start asking questions. How does COVID-19 impact workers' comp? How did that impact some general liability, business interruption claims? So previously, we would have to do a lot of that manually. And now we are asking these questions within a day or two and getting answers and business insights, not only from the SIU perspective, but from a business enterprise perspective as well. So the second lesson or takeaway is an engage data integrity and stewardship at enterprise level. If you're embarking and moving forward with the data analytics, it's a cliche, but it's so true: garbage in, garbage out. And so for a organization to be successful, lessons learned is you really got to take a realistic look at your holistic enterprise of where your data is. Is it accurate data, especially in the claims area? Are you looking at more claim field notes? Are you looking at structured data? Do you have the data that you need? Do you have to purchase the third-party data? Does your workflow support data analytics? For example, the way that you integrate photos into your claim center, metadata, all those little things that you don't really think about from a user endpoint when you start to embark on that venture. But it's so critical in order for you to kind of see that goal in sight. So the third thing is embrace change management. And I tell you, I think that's been one of the biggest opportunities, I think any organization, is that when you move towards using any type of digital or analytics, it is not a plug and play one event and you're done. It is something that is continuous, where you are going to have to get support from your senior leadership. One of the main things is showing that impact, that return on investment. In addition to that is, embracing change management is you're going to start seeing those business insights that typically you would not see. And for us in SIU, that opened the door to kind of build those relationships with all the stakeholders, because as you know, fraud is not just an SIU problem, it is an enterprise problem. Thank you, Anand.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thanks a lot, Jessica. I see your point. So the agility, data integrity, and the change management, these are three very critical aspects for a successful program. I see your point. In my own experience, Jessica, you talked about the maturity continuum. We've seen the maturity continuum, and we saw that, at the lowest end of the continuum, we had the descriptive analytics, which basically answers the question of, what's happening, followed by the diagnostic analytics. Now, why could something be happening, followed by the predictive analytics, what is likely to happen going further. And then finally, the highest level of the maturity at this point of time is the prescriptive analytics, where the system is going to make recommendations. If there is a particular claim with a level of medical complexity, then the system may either recommend you the right provider, or it might even recommend you the medical treatment course. So now those kind of systems. So yeah,
Yes.
the maturity continuum is important. And when an organization embarks upon the journey to basically able to deploy these technologies, I think it's good to introspect of where you stand on this maturity continuum, because the set of priorities and the set of strategy that you might deploy could vary depending upon your preparedness and your objectives. Right. That's important.
Right.
Thanks a lot, Jessica. I appreciate your inputs there.
Thank you.
Going to you, Steve. Steve, you have an extremely tough task, managing the risk for one of the largest public entities in US, right? A lot of accountability, stresses, pulls, a lot of strings attached. And in spite of that, you have to perform. So what kind of technologies are being deployed by county to take care of the fraud? And what tangible gains have you actually realized?
Well, as you just mentioned, it just depends on where we started out. Was our maturity level was very immature. We were
Right.
pre-teens, and the County of Los Angeles was kind of operating with paper everything and in the dark ages. So we did have to build our technologies up along with the skill set of the employees that we have in-house, as well as with our third-party administrators, and it was started with a simple dashboard. That's what it started with. And when I first got there about 9 years ago, we had spreadsheets, and that's how we were going through things, and we were looking at one thing or another. But what we were finding is we were seeing where we were having excess loss, but that's it. We weren't getting anything else. And then once we uncovered problems, whether with the physicians or the employees or what have you, the treatment providers, we are already into millions, if not tens of millions of dollars of loss by the time we got to a point where we could put a stop to it. So what we quickly discovered is with unions and public service, going after employee fraud is pretty hard, and you're going to spend a lot of time and effort and money going after our employees that have either are fraudulent or, as mentioned earlier, they're just taking they're taking more days off than they really need to, and their doctors are supporting on it. Right. So we decided to move into the healthcare providers. And some of our first analytics that we started putting together is we wanted to look at suspicious vendor relationships. And it was mentioned earlier, I think, from Dennis about physicians referring to physical therapists and other types of people, pharmacies and what have you. And that kind of developed into finding and prosecuting kickback schemes, billing from ghost companies that we finally figured out that it was organized crime rings, billing from vendors who are billing in vendors. When I say vendors, I mean the treatment providers who are billing outside of their specialties and just adding really nefarious coding. And pharmacy frauds. And it basically has saved us at least $40 million that we've actually had to not pay And I know we've recovered from physicians and some of these kickback schemes in the neighborhood of $20 to $30 million when all is said and done. So it's pretty significant, but it's also ever changing. And the analytics that we have in process or in play now, we have to continually develop because we uncover, and by reading the newspaper or reading the trade journals, you can see all the other schemes that are coming about. And I'm always talking to my people that develop our analytics saying, hey, look at this fraud, look at this anomaly. Can we put something in here that detects it on our system? And it's very productive, but it's always changing.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot, Steve. In fact, LA County has been, in my little experience, has been one of the most progressive organizations within the public entities for deploying and leveraging these kind of technologies. And what you just said is the amount of money that you saved by these technologies is pretty staggering. So my compliments to you. That's taxpayers' money back to their pockets. So that's fantastic.
And that's
right
what
now,
I hear. It's the taxpayers' money, and and it is, and and if you live in Los Angeles, our taxes are high. So it's my job, at least from a risk manager standpoint, to keep them down as much as I can contribute.
Right. Sure. Thanks a lot, Steve. Now, moving to Frank. Frank, you've been an architect and a creator of fraud detection system yourself. So what are the factors that one should consider for deploying, either developing and deploying these kind of technologies within their own organization?
Yeah, thanks, Anand. What you heard from Jessica, Dennis, and Steve is an opportunity. And we see that opportunity bifurcating along artificial intelligence boundaries. The first is traditional AI, things like workflow. Jessica talked about the need for workflow. And what we think of workflow in terms of automating the workflow or semi-automating the workflow. We believe the best robot is a hybrid of human plus machine. And as such, if I can free up a person's hour away from data entry, I free up that person to then use their minds to move the needle forward when it comes to fraud. I can identify things more readily because I'm not distracted through data entry. So we are using a lot of technologies to make that happen. The second you heard everybody talk about is, of course, predictive models. And while on the surface, even for me as I was going through my master's in data science, I thought, hey, we can predict fraud. It's actually hard to predict fraud because in order to train a model to be able to understand fraud, you have to know that that claim was fraudulent. Well, oftentimes you don't know that. And so the worst thing you can do is think you are predicting fraud when you're really not, because the criminals are way ahead of you. So that's a real danger spot for us. And so we tend to look at it more like, what are the anomalies in a claim, and to be able to constantly evolve those anomalies. But we're also predicting other kinds of things. You heard Dennis talking about looking at imagery, looking at diagnostics, looking at invoicing, and predicting whether or not it is unusual or it is somehow suspect. That's how we look at it. And as we put the two together, I now have looked at more anomalies and I can identify them more readily, and I've freed up humans to investigate those things. That to me is sort of this perfect union of AI, which includes both workflow, traditional AI, and machine learning. And to get to that point, there's really 5 things that you need. You need skills. Do you have it? Can you get it? Do you trust it? I think that last part is probably the most important. You heard everybody talk about data, same kind of a thing. Do you have it? Can you get it? Do you trust it? I think that question's a lot more complicated. Jessica alluded to it as well. I think it's really difficult to get really good data in this space, but it's not impossible by any means. And Dennis gave a great example of using social media. How can I know if somebody's disco dancing when they're on a work comp claim? Well, I can build predictive models to be able to look at those things, to not say that the person was disco dancing, but to say, this looks unusual to me as a computer. Human, can you then make the determination? That's how we have that relationship. The third thing is process. Do you have workflow that can incorporate these things into it? It's at least even in our case, we don't. We are only just now getting to the point where we can, because what is the traditional workflow based on? It's based upon data entry and document management. That is the lifelong kind of bread and butter into core systems of workflow. Now we're thinking that's not really all that exciting anymore. And I'm glad to hear that, by the way, because I never really thought it was all that exciting. But regardless, as we move the needle on process, can your systems handle it? Can your people handle it? Then we get into technology. What are your abilities in technology? What are the things that you're willing to spend on technology? Not everybody can have a massive fleet of data scientists or GPUs sitting at their disposal. It doesn't always work that way, but you don't always need that. But you have to be honest about the technology capabilities. And then last but not least, an ethical and regulatory environment that you can make sure you're checking the checkers. It's really, really critical because the ethics of AI are very, very complex. Everything from identifying claim fraud incorrectly to the biases that can come in. There's natural human bias, but more importantly, there's statistical bias that can be introduced in the process at any step, completely by accident, completely with good intentions. And when you have really, really large data sets, it's really hard to detect whether or not you've done it right or wrong. So do you have all those 5 pieces, yes or no? If you don't, it helps you to kind of create a framework for your vision going forward.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. These are wonderful inputs, Frank, and I'm sure many in the audience could use these important inputs to refine their own programs. That's important. Just one important component that we used, Frank, just taking the liberty of pitching in. We started with the predictive analytics and, we kind of built the models, and then the models weren't delivering. And, I kept wondering, why aren't they? But then finally, we kind of cracked it because I realized that at least for claims like workers' comp, the crux of being able to detect also lies in the adjuster nodes, because a lot of behavioral red flags, which are there, are really not coded as the database fields. They happen to be within the adjuster nodes, or in many cases, the diaries. And then we worked at creating a very sophisticated natural language processing, NLP-based text mining algorithms. And when we merged the text mining algorithms with the database field, the predictive modeling, and then the results which came out were pretty impressive. So you're right. So apart from what you mentioned, text mining is another very promising area to refine. Yeah, absolutely.
We do a lot of the same thing, by the way. We do a lot. Free-form text is probably the most common type of data that we get, other than maybe images. But free-form text, it is just a treasure trove of information. However, it's a treasure that is kind of difficult to find. You really do need a map. It's kind of hard to build.
That is a bit difficult to crack for sure. But once you do it, then the rewards can really be worth it. Yeah. Sure. Thanks a lot, Frank. From my personal experience, let me share some very interesting observations. A few months back, we were deploying the Klear.ai predictive suite at one of the TPAs. And this TPA manages over 150 clients across public entities and the schools and the corporates. And we did an exploratory data analysis, EDA in short. And this kind of analysis we do to get a feel of the hidden patterns within the data, and if all the fields are available, et cetera, et cetera. And the focus here was the claimant fraud. Provider fraud is a very different animal altogether. Now, I'll share some very interesting facts, because this might resonate with a lot of people within the audience as well. We realized that the fraudulent claims, or the suspicious claims actually, have a relatively higher total incurred compared to non-suspicious claims. So the ticket size of the fraud claims are relatively high. To give the feel of numbers, 1% of the strongly suspicious claims corresponded to 7% of the total incurred. A bit diluted, what we call as reasonably suspicious. 5% of these reasonably suspicious claims contributed to 22% of the overall incurred amounts. And if I were to add these two statistics, then 6% of the number of claims that they had in the portfolio for the last 10 years, that contributed to almost 1/3 the cost of the portfolio. Just doing a quick maths, you realize that typically the ticket sizes are going to be larger. And that's kind of understandable intuitively. Apart from the total incurred, we looked at what are the favorite injury causes that the fraudulent claims have. I mean, is there a pattern to look at? And then we realized that the top 5 injury causes amounted to 40% of the overall cost, right? So just 5%, top 5 causes, 40%. So that's quite a data to have. The top one being the slip and fall. We saw a lot of fraudulent cases within other than fiscal causes, the non-somatic kind of illnesses. Vehicle accident was pretty misused. Repetitive motion was again one of the culprits used extensively. Hit by object handled by others was the 5th one. So all these 5 causes together can't be 50%. Then again, but one needs to be mindful of the kind of data they're looking at. So in your data, these causes could be different, but you certainly might see some kind of skew between the causes and the percentages. Then another factor we looked at is a claimant filing multiple claims in a short span of time has a higher probability of committing a fraud, right? But then you just need to be mindful of the risky profiles like the police or the firefighters. But if you exclude those profiles, then you would not expect a claimant to file multiple claims in a very short span of 3 years or 4 years. Another very interesting fact for everyone is the report lag, the difference between the incident date and the reported date. We realized that higher is the report lag, higher is the probability of fraud. To give numbers, the claims which were reported within 60 days had a 4 times more probability of fraud than the ones which are reported within 10 days. So this could be another flag, that could be utilized because the data conclusively points towards that. We looked at the claimant age. We realized 40 to 55 years is one of the brackets where we saw the largest incidences of fraud. Now, the last parameter was the marital status. And we saw that the divorced and the separated claimants have a higher probability of fraud compared to the single and married. So these were just quick observations. Of course, we looked at around 18-20 different variables, but I thought these are worth kind of sharing. Sure. Now, in the first section, we kind of discussed about the technology and how effective have these technologies been, and the kind of savings that one could look at. Now, in the section that we have now, we're going to look at the non-technology aspects of deploying the risk management or risk prevention initiatives. So let us check from the panelists. What are the other factors apart from technology that needs to be managed well to make the most out of these technologies? Let me start with Steve. Steve, how should one manage the buy-in from the stakeholders while starting this journey?
Well, and it's the most critical thing, and I say this a lot to a lot of people from anything in government, but it was in business when I was in business as well, is you have to be able to tell your story. You just have to, and you have to be able to articulate what the problem is, what's your plan, how you're going to execute it, and what your expectations are, whether it's in costs or savings. If you can tell a simple story, and I always call it the elevator story, if you can tell that story from the time it takes you to get into the first floor to the 10th floor to somebody who's one of the stakeholders or one of the decision makers, you've got your story. And I can't tell you how many times I've had to do exactly that. And when you walk in the elevator and it's like, oh, hello, and this is who I am, and you just start, you give your pitch, your elevator pitch. You also have to find a champion. We can't do this in a vacuum. If we don't have partners, whether it's from the IT side, the finance side, the C-suite side, the board side and for me, it's almost impossible to get started. So we have to find a champion who's going to help you when you find into obstacles. For me, the last piece for me was taking baby steps. If we decided to do a full-on suite of everything, the systems that we deploy now would have never been built. They would have never got off the ground. And we allowed enough time on our little baby steps to show results, which then helped me go back to the first thing about telling my story, because then I can revise the story about, well, this is where we started, this is where we need to go. And then you build that credibility and about what's going on and how it's going. And that's really the key to my success of getting a very archaic government system to moving forward on a lot of technology that they never even contemplated 9 years ago.
Right. And looking at your success, I can bet you are a fantastic storyteller. Yeah, that's important. That's important. Yeah. Sure. Jessica, my question to you is, how do you balance the ethical and the compliance guidelines while taking a strict action against a fraudulent claimant or a morally challenged provider?
So in my world, I would say this would be a loaded question, but it's a very important question for this conversation and very important question to ask in your organization. It was interesting. I'm actually currently in the Master's of Science program with Mercyhurst for cyber risk management. And one of our classes was on the ethics of computing. And one of the books, the author, Joseph Kisa, he had coined the phrase, new wine in an old bottle, to describe ethics in computing. And I just thought that resonated because, you know, everybody here on the panel, our attendees out there, especially in the SIU and claims world, we already have that good foundation and that framework of how to conduct ethical and professional investigations. But today we're challenged now with the new technology and digital advancements that have created new situations that don't fit into that historical ethical framework. You know, that kind of falls outside those ethical principles that we're so familiar with. Frank, you alluded to it a little bit earlier. Anand, you had talked about it as well. And, you know, for example, you know, kind of playing around with those scenarios with AI. And Frank, you had mentioned that it doesn't predict fraud and tell the claim rep or the SIU that there's fraud. It gives you some context. It gives you some maybe anomalies or some behaviors or characteristics in that file that may say, stop, caution, we need to further look at this claim. But because of how fast that we're getting that, it puts the investigator and the claim rep in a position where we're very involved in those claims, sometimes at FNOL. And so we're looking at maybe past claims history or maybe open source or some information that we've seen in a past claims history where maybe we did surveillance. But it's just, we just got this claim. We're at FNOL. They haven't presented a BI yet. So it kind of gives us all these different questions and situations that we are put in that, again, in order to be conducting an ethical and professional investigation, we have to start having those dialogues and the conversations. And so I will say that for us and anybody, you know, as we're kind of looking at the ethical framework of using AI, predictive analytics, any of that digital transformation, is you probably have more questions than you have answers. And that's when you need to reach out to your stakeholders. And that's where, you know, the realistic dialogue with legal, compliance, talk about those scenarios. And those are the type of questions and conversations from a risk management strategy that you really need to be having. And I'll say there's two key areas, I think, for SIU and claims when you're looking at the predictive analytics in the fraud arena, and that's integrity and transparency of the data. You have to raise those questions about consent, especially if you're using third-party data. You talk about medical bills. There's a whole policy and law, you know, governing data and privacy and security with health records.
Right.
You got to make sure that, you know, especially, and I don't want to get into the weeds, but, Steve, being out in California, that's a whole nother area when you come to data analytics and data privacy. So those are some of the things that you need to start thinking about when you're conducting those investigations. And then I would have to say bias. That's my second one. And I think everybody on the panel has already mentioned this, because, the AI solutions that, we have mirror the biases of our human developers, and even the people in SIU who are validating those scenarios and those models. So I think that's just something that you need to validate, be aware, and have some conversation, and make sure you are asking those questions to make sure that you're not losing sight of that. And then the last word or last nugget I would leave with that is that you better make sure you have a mitigation strategy in place if the outcome is not what you expected.
Sure. Those, that would really help. Yeah, those are good points. I wish we could have gone on, but then we have the limitation of time.
Yes.
So this brings us to the conclusion of our panel discussion. I thank the panelists for sharing the insights very generously. And I do hope that the audience would find the insights useful in taking your own fraud prevention initiatives to the next level. Thanks again, and all of you have a great one. Thanks.
Thank you to our panel for a wonderful discussion.